You good? Really? You have done a few. Didn't get it quite up.
Right, the inquiry is resumed. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, sir. I can limit what I ask the witness. I don't think you need to hear from us on overall balance. I think that's in the proof, and you've got just what
Thank you.
has been said. Unless you wish us to do that, I don't think we need to do that. Just heritage, and just one point on heritage.
Okay.
You adopt what Dr. Millet says in terms of policy, approach, and substance. I'll ask you about that. But I will ask you about the relevance of the GDPO rights to demolish.
Yeah.
Which the inspector's got a helpful note on now from the local authority as well. That's a change that's been brought about by government. What in your view, your professional view, what does it tell us, if anything, in policy terms, about the level of protection that decision makers think is appropriate for buildings of this nature?
Well, as a matter of policy, as a matter of fact, obviously it's afforded no protection. Permitted development rights exist to demolish the building. The decision clearly taken by Historic England and Westminster City Council, in accordance with their duties, obviously clearly to exclude it from the conservation area, to not list it and grant a certificate of immunity, meaning that as a matter of policy and law, there's no impediment to demolition. It's permitted development, and therefore development that the government believes is appropriate in policy terms.
Thank you. This will be dealt with in the note that the inspector asked for, but
I have it already from the council.
no, the other note you asked us, sir, about whether we intend to.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, that's coming. But in terms of whether there's an intention to demolish by Marks and Spencer, who are just the tenants, of course, or not, does that take away from the policy position that one reads from the granting of planning permission for buildings in this of this nature in this location?
Well, no, granting of permission as PD grants with the land, and any prospective developer of the site would be able to exercise that right.
Thank you. Return to your proof at 859. Page 64. Where you indicate what might happen in relation to a landowner in the circumstances that the building is found to be, if you like, an impediment to the redevelopment of the site, bearing in mind that government has granted planning permission for its demolition.
Yes, well, as I say, I think through the normal course of events, and as Marks and Spencer quite properly applied here, is that one wouldn't go down that route. You would apply for planning permission for demolition and redevelopment, because that would be the conventional approach. And in this case, after 4 years, that yielded a resolution to approve and support the GLA, and that would be the normal course of events. But clearly, in the event that the presence of Orchard House and the retention of Orchard House became an impediment to a viable development of the site, it would be a different equation. I can't surmise, I see no reason why M&S would demolish the building, because M&S as a tenant, I think, simply would close the store and probably sell the site. So I'm only surmising, but I can't see any reason why they would demolish the site. I think they're simply closed. But if a developer acquiring the site and as a prime development opportunity, if that was an impediment to a viable development, then it would be a logical consideration to say that we've got, that's a non-issue, we can demolish.
Thank you very much. That's all I asked.
Thank you very much.
That's the end of the examination, Chief. Thank you.
Mr. Fraser, are you ready?
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Mr. Goddard, I'll structure the cross-examination into the following 3 parts. Firstly, demolition without a new building.
Yep.
Secondly, looking at policies and guidance on growth and sustainability and so on. And then thirdly and finally, we'll touch on some issues arising in relation to refurbishment, but noting, of course, that I've already cross-examined Mr. Kilgrove, which you presumably heard virtually.
I did hear virtually that, yes.
So you'll forgive me if I'm not going to run
Yeah.
a number of those questions.
No,
again.
understood, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So the documents that you will be taken to for the purposes of these questions are as follows. Firstly, CD 10.1, which is the Annex B. This is the statement of common ground between the applicant and M&S, and I'm particularly interested in the conditions in Annex B. Secondly, the London Plan, CD 6.2. Thirdly, the City Plan, CD 6.3. Then the Circular Economy LPG, CD 6.30.
Yeah.
The LPG on whole life carbon assessment, CD 6.32. And then lastly, CD 10.15, which is the rebuttal of Mel Orwood.
Okay. No, I don't have hard copies of those. I'll obviously follow electronically if that.
That's fine.
If I get it.
Whatever works for you, Mr. Goddard.
Would it be useful for me to open them all now or as we go?
As you wish.
Okay. See if I can get all of those up. So can you just give me the CD 10.1 is the. Yeah.
And it helps to get them up to a point, and when you're up to about
Yeah,
20, it
I'm-
ceases to be useful.
This is where in lockdown with 3 screens, it was very easy, but in the real world, I do find it easier to do one document at a time. Would that be possible, Mr. Rayson?
Of course, Mr. Goddard. Yeah, and it should help that my list is in broadly chronological order.
Okay, well,
So
I've got the statement of common ground in front of me.
very good. Okay, so you'll also need to have up your proof of evidence. Already.
Thanks.
So the first point I just want to consider with you is this point about demolition of the building in advance of having planning permission for a new building on the site. And in your evidence in chief, you said that the ability of the owner of the site to demolish without needing to apply for planning permission from the local planning authority was to quote you, a highly material consideration.
Yeah.
And do you accept that the possibility of demolition in the absence of new build is only a material consideration if it's what's known as a fallback in planning terms? I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. Do you accept that?
No, I understand the question and the concept of fallback. No, I don't think it's only relevant as a fallback. It's relevant as to weight and policy statute attached to the significance of the building, that it can be demolished without consent. So it has no protection because the government, the laws, the policy is that it doesn't warrant that protection, and that's a highly material consideration. Whether it's enacted or not,
Right.
it is. I think the second part of your question is as a fallback.
Yeah.
And as I've said, I think it would only be a fallback in the event that it was an impediment to a new owner,
Yes.
that it became an impediment and it was therefore the logical thing to do.
Well, let's explore that, because my understanding of your demolition without new building argument was that it was being presented as a what if planning permission is refused type argument. Was that fair?
It's presented as hopefully fairly in 8.59 in my proof, not presented it as a likelihood that Marks Spencer or a threat, heaven forbid that this is a threat that Marks Spencer would do it. It's that in the event that consent is refused, Marks and Spencer closes as they've stated their intention to do so, and this becomes a development site and is sold to a potential developer, is that it would be a rational and logical thing for a developer to do if that was an impediment to delivering a viable scheme for the site. That's the way I put it.
Okay, so let's think about that then. For it to be a fallback, which the tracks materiality as a consideration. There needs to be a real prospect of such development coming forward. You accept that as a matter of law.
Well, if you're running the fallback argument, as I
Yeah.
said, there's a materiality point,
Yeah.
and secondly, the probability or the likelihood of it happening is obviously based on a set of circumstances, being that it is the impediment to development. So I can't point to a developer now saying I'm going to knock it down tomorrow. Logically, you wouldn't. If it became an impediment, then rationally, any developer, landowner of the site would exercise the legal right to knock it down if that overcame an impediment to a viable development. That's the point I'm making.
Okay, so with that in mind, are you inviting the inspector to treat demolition without a new building as a fallback?
I'm inviting the inspector to treat the possibility of that on the basis of a prospective new owner of the site, if it was an impediment to development of the site, that it would be a rational thing to do. So I'm inviting the inspector to attach weight to the possibility of that happening, if that is an impediment to redevelopment of the site.
So yes, is the answer to my question.
Yes.
Okay, so therefore your position to the inspector is that there is a real prospect of demolition in the absence of new building, because that's
In a set of circumstances in the future, there is a real prospect of that option being exercised if that becomes the rational thing to do. I'm not saying there's a real prospect of that now, because obviously pending this decision, nobody would demolish the site while it's currently operational in advance of a planning determination.
So it may be a real prospect in the future, but it's not a real prospect.
But it's not a real prospect while Marks and Spencer is trading from the store and this process is ongoing. It is, in my view, a real prospect when Marks and Spencer is sold the site to a future party,
Right.
and in the event that the retention of Orchard House is an impediment to the redevelopment.
Can I just put something, if you'll excuse me a moment?
Of course.
You talked about Marks and Spencer's owning and selling up, and then you talked about them being a tenant. What is, I mean, I know the 106 has got two other names on it.
Yes,
What is the position?
in broad terms, they hold a very long lease. So I
Right.
think the freehold owner is the Fortnum estate, I think.
Yeah,
maybe
what I
that's correct.
assumed.
But I think it's a very long leasehold. So in essence, Marks and Spencer is the principal owner of in all intents and purposes, as the owner of the site, will be able to sell the site and their long lease
So they could sell.
to a developer
Right.
to redevelop the site.
And just while I'm on that point, the fourth name on the 106.
That is probably going beyond my knowledge. So
Okay, so someone can tell me outside the inquiry. Thank you. Sorry, Mr.
So thank you. Okay, so Mr. Goddard, you're not saying, it's no part of your case to say, or indeed your instructions from your client to say that there's a real prospect of M&S doing a demolition without planning permission for a new building. It's not part of your evidence.
no, my evidence is that Marks and Spencer, if they can't secure the scheme, would close the store, not demolish it.
And that, so therefore, your evidence is that there is a real prospect of a future owner of the site demolishing without planning permission for a new building.
I think there is a real prospect if that is, if the retention of Orchard House is an impediment to a viable development of the site, which it is.
So you're caveating it, and then you're saying that the caveat is satisfied. So you say there is a real prospect.
Yes, I'm caveating on the premise that the consent has been refused, and it's been refused because weight is attached to the retention of Orchard House. So if that becomes the impediment to realising the development potential of this site, by law, the government has decreed that there's no problem in knocking it down. So why would a developer not do that?
And that is your suggestion to the inspector, but of course, because we don't know anything about who that future owner might be, it's not possible for you to actually present evidence to support the
Well,
assertion.
I presented evidence on as a planning consultant in the circumstances that I've described in the future, that would be a rational thing that any developer or landowner would be advised is a rational response to that issue. My primary point is that it is a highly material consideration to the weight to be attached to the retention of Orchard House. The fact that the government has decreed that it is not protected and it can be knocked down without without requirement for consent. That's my primary point.
Okay. So let's just have a look at that then. Let's assume that someone does try. Let's assume that there is a real prospect of someone seeking to demolish the building without having obtained planning permission for a new building. What if someone were to try and do that? And to understand how the council might respond to that, can we look at those the conditions in the statement of common ground? And I know that there was obviously discussion of the conditions last week, and that there is going to be a revised version of these. But I think for the purpose of these questions, I can ask them on the basis of the conditions as they're set out here in Annex B, Statement of Common Ground,
Okay.
which is electronic page 25, Sarah, if you're looking at it electronically.
Remind me of the core document number.
CD 10.1.
Number 1, thank you. Yeah.
Does that come after the 106?
Before.
Before that, sorry.
So page 25 electronically.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
So that's where the conditions start. The conditions I want to have a look at are condition 14 and 15, which are, they're not numbered, but it's electronic page 27.
I'm not getting the pages, but they're not numbered.
They are numbered.
I've got 14 as a pre-commencement condition.
Good.
Yeah.
Pre-commencement condition, you must not start any demolition work on site until we have approved in writing either a construction contract for the builder to complete the redevelopment work for which we've given planning permission, or B, an alternative means of ensuring we are satisfied that demolition on the site will only occur immediately prior to development of the new building.
Yeah.
You must carry out the demolition and development according to the approved arrangements. Reason to maintain the setting of Portland Estate, Mayfair and Stratford Place conservation areas and the setting of the Grade 2 site listed building at 400 Oxford Street, Selfridges. So there's that condition. Secondly, condition 15, you must not carry out demolition work unless it is part of the complete development of the site. You must carry out the demolition and development without interruption and according to the drawings we have approved. Reason to maintain the setting of the Portland Estate, Mayfair, Stratford Place conservation areas and the setting of the Grade 2 star listed building at 400 Oxford Street, Selfridges. And then there's some stuff about public art, which I'm not going to read out. I think that's actually the next condition. So 14 and 15. There's no dispute between yourselves and also the council. These are conditions which fulfil the test of necessity.
In the context of a planning application where this becomes relevant, using those conditions, but obviously in the context of a no consent prior notice, as the city council's statement, council's statement makes clear, the council would have no control over those matters other than by prior notice procedure, which is simply about the means of demolition.
We'll come to that, but it's clear, isn't it, that the imposition of conditions 14 and 15 is agreed by all parties as being necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms.
I think that's right. They meet the tests in terms of a planning consent where this becomes relevant. But
Yeah.
they don't detract from the permitted development position.
And they indicate clearly that the council would not want to have a vacant site where there is essentially a demolished building and no new building in place. Quite clear from those conditions that that's not what the council
No,
wants to see.
I'm sure that's the case, and I'm sure that nobody would want a cleared site. The point I'm making is that if the Orchard House retention became an impediment to the beneficial redevelopment of this site, and that was the only option, then a developer, future owner of the site would consider exercising that right. I mean, nobody's suggesting that's a good thing. I think it would be a very bad thing.
And one of the things which the council's note doesn't consider, nor have you considered, is that in response to an application or in response to a prior notification, the local authority does have the ability, doesn't it, to extend the boundary of the conservation area.
It has the ability to do so, but is obviously, as the evidence has shown, has consistently resisted the temptation to do so because the situation would not be changed, which is that it does not, the site doesn't warrant inclusion from the conservation area. There would be no difference. The decision to exclude it from the conservation area was taken notwithstanding that permitted development rights have always existed for this building.
Well, I traversed these matters with Dr. Mealy last week, so I'm not going to run through them with you as well, Mr. Goddard. But the simple point is that the local planning authority would be in a position, if it were to have the same concerns that motivated conditions 14 and 15, to extend the conservation area boundary in response to a prior notification.
Yeah, unless I stand corrected on points of law, right? I think that's probably right. But again, suggesting that the likelihood of that happening, bearing in mind that City Council has not sought to do so at any point, I think it is unlikely. And these conditions arise obviously from the City Council wanting this redevelopment to take place.
The council to date have had would have no reason to believe there was any risk of demolition in the absence of a new building.
Is it that they would, in the sense that the council is fully aware of what the permitted development rights allow. Westminster City Council is obviously aware of how the law operates in the sense of conservation areas and listed buildings, and that buildings outside of conservation areas have permitted development right for refusal for demolition. That's always been the case, and that's obviously a factor that Westminster can always take into account in considering when they do extend boundaries of conservation areas.
Has M&S ever evinced an intention to demolish the building in the absence of obtaining planning permission for a new building?
No, for the reasons I've outlined, there's been no need to do so on the basis that M&S's approach with the City Council over the last 4 years has been a collaborative process of negotiation for secure consent and all these safeguards.
So in the absence of any intention on the part of the owner, what reason would the council have to believe of any prospect at all of the building being demolished in the absence of planning permission for a new building?
Well, the council would have exactly the same thought process that I would have and that I've explained, which is that in the event that, and this is obviously not something the council thinks is appropriate, but in the event that the retention of Orchard House became an impediment to the council achieving its policy objectives for this site, it would recognise, because the council is a very well advised and informed party, that if that became the impediment to the redevelopment of the site and the future owner wanted to knock the buildings down, they'd be perfectly entitled to do so. So the City Council is very aware of all these possibilities.
That's everything on demolition. Next part of the cross-examination is looking at the policy and the guidance, which apparently you're the only witness to consider the policy context in this case. So let's ask you some questions about that. In your evidence in chief, you referred to framework firstly in relation to this. So you've got a copy of the framework memorised by now.
Well, I'm not going to trust my memory, but I'll have a go. I'll put it in front of me as well. So.
I'm not going to expect any memorising at all. Paragraph 8 is the paragraph that you were looking at with my learned friend.
Yeah.
And it's about, in general terms, achieving sustainable development and the three overarching objectives. We're all familiar with this paragraph.
Yeah.
It's right, isn't it, that there's no reason as a matter of principle why a retrofit scheme for this building could not also be found to be sustainable development for the purposes of paragraph 8 of the framework. In principle, I know that's not your view, but in principle.
Well, I mean, in principle, if a retrofit met the policy requirements for the site and was viable and deliverable and delivered all the policy objectives for the site, then of course there's no reason why, in principle, that would not meet all those objectives. But it's a sort of caveat. If it meets all the objectives, it meets all the objectives. But obviously that's a theoretical question.
So I want to now look at something which you referred to in your evidence as the good growth agenda. And for this purpose, let's start with your rebuttal, just to position these questions. Can you take up your rebuttal, please?
Are we done with the NPPF?
For now, yeah. And in your Okay. In your rebuttal, starting with paragraph 2.3.
Yeah.
You say, second sentence, in this respect, it is notable the SAFE makes no attempt to consider the overarching strategy, the development plan and the policy imperatives to promote good growth and reinforce that the CAS international centre. And these were themes which you explored also in evidence in chief. So just taking that paragraph firstly, and also secondly, paragraph 3.2, Mr. Forshaw, you say makes no reference to a series of GG policies and then ST 4, 6 and 8. And then lastly, paragraph 6.5 of your proof, you say the selected quotes Mr. Forshaw makes refer to the non-statutory LPG, which is guidance and cannot be read in a way which frustrates the meeting of the overall good growth agenda. Can I start by taking up the city plan, which is CD 6.3, and looking at page 148.
Novelty.
148.
Yes.
And at policy 39B 3, we see that development will place heritage at the heart of placemaking and good growth. And I assume it's common ground between me and you that heritage is something which has to be placed at the heart of good growth.
Yes, it's one of those important considerations for sure.
Thank you. And then over on page 150, supporting text paragraph 39.1, we see the third sentence, given its immense contribution to the character, economy and quality of life of our city, it is vital that the historic environment is valued, maintained and refurbished in ways appropriate to its significance and as an integral part of good growth. So it's clear, isn't it, that heritage is an integral part of good growth.
I think it's part of the overall planning framework. I think it's also reflective of the fact that Westminster obviously has a huge abundance of conservation areas and listed buildings, and you know, which actually, interestingly enough, makes it perhaps more significant that this site is, in that sense, relatively less constrained and linked to the overarching objectives of the city plan, which is to make the most effective use of sites. So, and of course, my view is that the proposals enhance the character and appearance of the area and the setting, but I know we won't agree on that.
CD 6.2 next is the London plan.
Yeah.
Page 24, please. GG5, growing a good economy.
Yes, thank you, got it.
And we see that there are a number of things which those involved in planning development must do. And among those, without prioritising any of them in particular, but we see at F, those involved in planning and development must promote and support London's rich heritage and cultural assets and its role as a 24-hour city. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And then we also see at H, those involved in planning and development must recognise and promote the benefits of a transition to a low carbon circular economy to strengthen London's economic success.
Yes, yeah, and they're all supported with the overarching principles to make the most effective use of sites.
Exactly. GG6 on page 26 then.
Yeah.
This is something my learned friend has already referred to. To help London become a more resilient and efficient and resilient city, those involved in planning and development must seek to improve energy efficiency and support the move towards a low carbon circular economy, contributing towards London becoming a zero carbon city by 2050. So best concepts like achieving good growth, complying with what you refer to as the good growth agenda, making the best use of land, they all involve integrally considerations of heritage and sustainability, among other matters, don't they?
Among other matters, yes, they're obviously factors that would weigh in the balance, yeah.
So a scheme, going to pose a theoretical example, but imagine a scheme which has significant benefits in terms of additional retail and office floor space, but considerations of heritage and sustainability might result in that not being consistent with the good growth agenda and not be the best use of land, theoretically.
Conceptually, I think the two points there. I mean, the heritage point, particularly if, for example, it was relating to a designated heritage asset, and the statutory weight that would carry, might be a more weighty consideration in that balance between making the best use of the site. The clear guidance in London Plan guidance relating to circular economy and whole life carbon, the guidance in both cases recognises that making the best use of the site might justify demolition of buildings, and therefore I think an explicit recognition that, in my view, that making the best use of the site would be a factor that would weigh against a literal sort of carbon interpretation. So you make the point in relation, I understand, to your case of heritage and sustainability. I'm just differentiating the two. Absolutely.
Next policy, which you considered in evidence in chief, which I just want to ask a series of questions actually about some of these policies that you looked at in evidence in chief. It's going to be the same question each time, just to give you advance warning. Page 70 of the London Plan, firstly, policy SD4.
Yeah.
Let me know when you're there.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
So my little friend took you to A and B. It's right and correct for the inspector to also consider C, the distinct environment and heritage of the CAS should be sustained and enhanced. Yep.
Yeah, that's a relevant consideration.
Relevant consideration. And we also then, just to explain that, we have at supporting text 2.4.9 on page 74. The distinct environment and heritage of the CAS should be sustained and enhanced through development decisions, local planning and other initiatives, such as the transformation of the Oxford Street district, including pedestrianisation of Oxford Street itself. Then going on to recognise strategic elements and so on. And indeed its unique concentration of heritage assets. So again, taking yourself outside of examining the particular facts of this case, in principle, an inspector could find that a scheme that is retrofitting a building, refurbishing a building, rather than demolishing and building it again, complies with policy SD4.
Well, I would personally say, and I know, appreciate this is a hypothetical example you're putting to me, that adopting the overall thrust of the policies, I think that it would be surprising if an inspector concluded that development which did not meet the objectives of the CAS and the International Centre should nonetheless should be supported wholly on the basis of a carbon point, certainly an embodied carbon point. I don't think there's a policy matrix that exists here that would support that decision.
That's not quite the question I asked, Mr. Goddard. I was only asking you a much simpler question, which is that in principle, a scheme that is seeking to refurbish an existing building, as opposed to knocking it down and demolish, could be treated as compliant with policy SD4 at London Home.
Okay, well, I'll answer it in a different way then. Yes, provided it meets the other policy objectives of good growth in terms of optimising the site and meeting the objectives for the CAS and the international centre.
Thank you. And then you looked at SD5, which is on page 79.
Yeah.
Again, same question. In principle, a scheme refurbishing an existing building could be policy compliant with this policy.
Well, if the existing buildings optimise the use of the site and make the most effective use of the site and are capable of being refurbished to meet modern office occupiers' requirements, I would say yes. If the existing and if a refurbishment scheme is feasible and viable, those are three quite important caveats. If the existing buildings were not making the most effective use of the site, were not fit for purpose, and were not capable of refurbishment, then no.
Sure, but that's the judgment that would need to be reached by the decision maker considering a scheme like that.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the outset, I think that if the M&S team, right at the outset of this process, had found a refurbishment solution that met all the policy objectives and commercial objectives, the M&S position is that they would pursue that.
And the same analysis applies in relation to policy SD8 on page 91.
Well, yes, in the sense that SD8 obviously talks about the flagship retail. So again, it's the same point in principle, I think, to me, which is that if there was a refurbishment scheme that met all policy objectives, including the objective to support and retain flagship retailing and underpin the vitality and viability of the centre, yes, and same answer that I gave a moment ago.
Yeah.
Clearly, we're not in that situation here.
There's no, in all of these policies we've been looking at, SD4, SD5, SD8, there's no policy steer in favour of demolition and new build, is there? It's neutral.
It's yes, I mean, I think neutral is a fair way to put it. There's no policy steer other than the overarching policy. If you read policy as a whole, the overall objectives, spatial strategy is about new floor space and delivering additional floor space. It's not just refurbishing existing. So there is a focus inevitably and obviously and quite intentionally on delivering additional floor space and new buildings, and in Westminster, new modern architecture. That there is a very specific focus on that. But I don't disagree that if you could meet all those objectives with a refurbished building, there's no impediment to that for sure. There's no requirement either, but there's no impediment.
Thank you very much. That's very fair. There was also some, I think actually now I'm going to turn to looking at policy D3, which is something you also touched on in your evidence in chief and of course also in your proof.
Yeah.
So policy D3 is on page 110 of the London plan. Policy D3, optimizing site capacity through the design-led approach. And we see that under the heading of design-led approach, all development must make the best use of land by following a design-led approach that optimizes the capacity of sites, including site allocations. Optimizing site capacity means ensuring that development is of the most appropriate form and land use for the site. The design-led approach requires consideration of design options to determine the most appropriate form of development that responds to a site's context and capacity for growth and existing and planned supported infrastructure capacity, and that best delivers the requirements set out in Part D. Then we see Part D further on. We've looked at this. One of the, I think, 14 different considerations is number 13, aim for high sustainability standards with reference to the policies within London Plan chapters 8 and 9, which include SI2 and SI7, which we'll come to look at in a moment. And we've then got some supporting text, which again we've already looked over, just so that you're aware of context for the questions that I'm going to be asking. 3.3.12 in the supporting text on page 114. There's the reference to figure 3.2 and the hierarchy of building approaches, which maximizes use of existing materials, diminishing returns are gained by moving through the hierarchy outwards, working through refurbishment and reuse, through to the least preferable option of recycling materials produced by the building or demolition process. The best use of the land needs to be taken into consideration when deciding whether to retain existing buildings in the development. And it's that final sentence that you yourself relied on your evidence. So with all of that in mind, sorry, just for completeness over the page, we do get 3.2, the circular economy hierarchy that is referred to in that supporting text. So with all of that in mind, let's take up your rebuttal and look at what you say at paragraph 3.9. And there, as I said, you do quote the supporting text, 3.3.12, the bit that we've read out, and then second last sentence of the paragraph on page 6 of your rebuttal, you say clearly, if retaining existing buildings would result in an important site not making best use of land, then the requirements of D3 would not be met. Yeah. And I assume logically the converse would also be the case. So if retaining existing buildings would result in an important site making best use of land, then the requirements of D3 would be met.
I think that limb of D3 will be met, but I mean, as you'll be aware, obviously D3 is an overarching design policy. So you know, if you look below 3.3.12, you've got maximising urban greening, inclusive places, designing out crime.
Sure.
So you know, to meet public realm,
Yeah.
so to meet the objectives of D3, you know, if you take the debate purely to an issue of retention versus new build, and taking the theoretical examples we've talked about, you can meet all the objectives through refurbishment. You know, on that clause alone, I think that you wouldn't be, you know, you'd be consistent with making the best use of the land. But that's a far cry from meeting all the policies of D3, which require public
That's a
realm
separate
permeability.
consideration.
Yes, but you know, they're very important considerations. That's why it's taken 4 years to get to this point, because we've had to consider all of those issues.
Okay, so that's perfectly fair. There are other parts of D3 that need to be complied with, but I know your answer. Thank you very much for that. In making the best use of land and deciding on, in the words, the language of policy D3A, deciding on the most appropriate form of development, one of the questions for firstly the applicant and then secondly the decision maker is, do I refurbish this building or do I demolish it and build a new one? That's one of the questions that one has to ask oneself.
Yes, but I think the question that becomes before that is, what's the policy requirement for the site, and the commercial realities of the site, which then lead to a consideration of, okay, well, we now know what policy requires and what's deliverable. I think you would then naturally say, well, can we deliver that within a retention of the existing buildings or extension or a new build? So, because it's very difficult to take that in principle decision in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Because I think, for example, you would look at what London Plan policies say and what Westminster's policies say about their requirements for the site. Because you'd have to know that before you basically then consider, can a refurbishment actually meet those requirements?
Right. So of course you need to look at the requirements, and once you've looked at the requirements, there's obviously going to be cases, aren't there, Mr. Goddard, where the best use of land is and the most appropriate form of development is to retrofit and refurbish the existing building rather than demolish it and build a new building.
Well, there will be examples. So,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, clearly, you know, Selfridges, for example, is a superb building that makes a very effective use of the site and is
operational. I mean, nobody would say, notwithstanding it's grade 2 star listed. It meets all of those criteria. And I would take the point with the other examples.
Sure, and it's always going to be a question of planning judgment in every case, what the best use of the land is.
It's planning judgment formed by policy.
Formed by
So,
policy.
policy here is very, very clear what is required and expected in the international centre and the CAS and in locations like this.
Yeah, and we know what your planning judgment is. You know what SA's planning judgment is. We don't know what the effective planning judgment is. But one thing that you did say in your evidence in chief, which I've took a careful note of, is that what the policies want, and I think you were collectively talking about a series of policies, including D3, is efficient, sustainable buildings, even new buildings, you said. That's what you said. I've noted it down exactly as you said. What the policies want is efficient, sustainable buildings, even new buildings. And so it would be open in any case, including in this case, for the decision maker to form the view that a scheme for refurbishment of the building achieves an efficient, sustainable building.
No, I mean, not in this case, because all the evidence, all the commercial evidence and all the design evidence from the applicant demonstrates quite the opposite, that a refurbishment cannot deliver an efficient, sustainable building. So no, I'm sorry, I disagree with you.
One of the things that you also said, and I think also it was perhaps in response to, I think it was in response to a question from my learned friends, that you say there's no inconsistency between making best use of land and making London zero carbon. Do you recall?
Yes.
And that's precisely because in the right case, don't know if that's this case or not, but in the right case, making the best use of land can involve a refurbishment as opposed to a new building.
Well, I think we've agreed that as a matter of principle in the right case, if the existing buildings are capable of meeting the policy requirements and delivery in a viable way that makes the most effective use of the site. There's no requirement or preference for that, but that is an option.
No, and that's essentially the debate, isn't it?
Well, that's not the debate I was making, because we're really talking about a zero-sum game between refurbishment of an existing building, which doesn't add any additional space. The point that I think I was trying to make in my evidence in chief is that in addition to making effective use and refurbishing existing buildings, that's not the position we're in. We're not in the position where London is set in aspect that it's not going to change and grow and develop. It has a huge requirement for additional modern high quality space and additional development, which can only be met by new development. It's not simply about refurbishing existing space. That won't meet the policy objectives for new homes and new employment space, nor will it meet the Westminster ambitions for new high quality architecture and design. So, no, I disagree. I think in isolation of one site versus another, a refurbishment of an existing building that makes effective use of the site could theoretically, subject to commercial issues and viability, could theoretically be as good as a new build. But that doesn't meet the London plan overarching objectives for growth and additional floor space.
What if the refurbishment did include additional floor space?
Well, if it can include additional floor space that meets all those policy requirements and the refurbished space can meet those requirements, then yes, it can contribute to that.
Good.
But it may, I say that's it. We're in a very hypothetical world. We know from Mr. Sturgis's position here that even on his assumptions, the additional floor space that he believes could be delivered here doesn't come close to delivering the most effective use of this site.
I think the difference was about 75%.
That's before you
That was what
have to
Mr.
carve
Gordon
out
said.
public realm improvements, but it's academic because it's not renewable.
The next policy I want to ask you some questions about is SI2, which is on page 342 of the London Plan, CD 6.2.
I'm there yet.
Yep. And This policy has a number of different sections to it. The section I want to ask you some questions about relates to part F of the policy, which is on page 343, which is that development proposals referable to the mayor should calculate whole life cycle carbon emissions through a nationally recognised whole life cycle carbon assessment, demonstrate actions taken to reduce life cycle carbon emissions. And there is then some text on page 345, paragraph 9.2.11, and actually over the page 346, the final sentence, the approach to whole life cycle carbon emissions assessments, including when they should take place, what they should contain, and how information should be reported, will be set out in guidance. Yep.
Yep.
And we know, of course, that guidance is LPG on whole life carbon assessments dated March 2022.
Yes.
And that is CD 6.32. So let's have a look at what CD 6.32 has to say. Okay. Paragraph 1.1.1. What is this guidance? This guidance explains how to prepare a whole life carbon assessment in line with policy SI2F of the London Plan 2021 using the WLC assessment template. Policy SI2F applies to planning applications which are referred to the mayor. However, WLC assessments are also supported and encouraged on major applications that are not replicated. And then 1.1.2, this guidance explains how to calculate WLC emissions and the information that needs to be submitted to comply with the policy. It also includes information on design principles, WLC benchmarks to aid planning applicants in designing buildings that have low operational carbon and low embodied carbon. If we then take up table 2.1, we see what are known in the guidance as WLC principles.
Yeah.
And the first of those principles of 16 is reuse and retrofit of existing built structures. Retaining existing built structures for reuse and retrofit in part or as a whole should be prioritised before considering substantial demolition, as this is typically the lowest carbon option. Significant potential in reuse of structures also reduces construction costs and can contribute to a smoother planning process. So that is what that says. And then lastly, before I ask you a question, circular economy, which is principle 16, page 10 of the guidance. The circular economy principle focuses on a more efficient use of materials, which in turn leads to financial efficiency, then optimize and recycle content, reuse and retrofit of existing buildings, and then designing new buildings for easy disassembly, reuse and retrofit. Recycling as equivalent components for future reuse are essential. Right. Next, I just want to make sure that we're covering this document as a whole. 3.1.3, which is on page 25. If substantial demolition is proposed, applicants will need to demonstrate that the benefits of demolition would clearly outweigh the benefits of retaining the existing building or parts of the structure. And just for context, we see that this is in a section of the guidance called pre-application stage. Yep.
1.3.
Yeah. In a section of the guidance that's dealing with pre-application stage. Yep. Retention should be seen as a starting point. It says this will usually be the most sustainable option as it can make an immediate contribution towards the mayor's objective of London becoming a zero carbon city by 2030, as well as reflecting the need to both move towards a low carbon circular economy and push development up the waste and energy hierarchies and see policies SI2 and SI7. 3.1.5. This is where there's a reference to the WLC principles in table 2.1, and then it says applicants should consider all of the principles subject to each development's unique characteristics, provide examples of how the design of the development has taken each principle into account, reasons for not considering certain principles should also be provided in the template. And then we see this sentence: applicants are encouraged to keep returning to the WLC principles throughout each stage of the WLC assessment, so that they continue to inform the design of the development as it evolves. So that is the guidance indicating a need to keep the application of the WLC principles under review throughout the lifetime of the application.
Well, I agree that's what it says. I think that for quite a while.
Can you hang on? Lovely, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, sir. You've got a number of points there, and I mean, if you're asking the question, do I think that you'd revisit the principles throughout the application process? Some possibly, because it is an ongoing process, but it's clear from the guidance, and as you've taken to 3.1.3, that it recognises at an early stage, indeed at the pre-app stage, demolition, substantial development can be the right outcome for a development site, and you should consider the benefits of new development as opposed to retaining. And if you look at the boxes, the principle of demolition is box 3, which is something that's considered at the pre-app stage, which is logical because, as we've discussed previously, it's a fundamental step in that process to decide whether this is a redevelopment or a refurbishment.
Right.
So if perhaps it's not, but forgive me if I'm jumping to what your question may be asking, but I think it would be absurd to suggest that throughout the entire application process, you consistently revisit box 3, which is to consider the principle of demolition, if that was the question you were putting to me.
Right. So you're not suggesting that your interpretation of 3.1.5 is that applicants are encouraged to keep returning to the WLC principles, but not the principle of demolition. Well, that's your interpretation.
Well, it's not. It is my interpretation, and I think it's the only rational interpretation on the facts. If you look at box 3 that says what you need to do at pre-app stage, you look at the principles of demolition, which we've done in this case. When you then get to box 4, which is at the application stage,
right,
you then look at the detail. And of course, it's fair to say that only at box 4, at the application stage, is there a requirement for a whole life carbon assessment. So the exercise undertaken at pre-app at box 3 is not a whole life carbon assessment. It's actually an assessment of the principles of demolition, which was done in this case. You don't revisit that. Certainly, I don't read that anywhere in the guidance.
So you draw a line at that point and say we're now proceeding with a new build. We don't reconsider that at any stage.
If a fundamental change of circumstances arose that might completely change, the conclusion that had already been reached, I'm struggling to think what that might be. But I mean, clearly, in this case, that all the options for refurbishment were carefully considered, discussed with the GLA and with the City Council. I can't conceive of a set of circumstances where any of those would have changed. If one of them, if those circumstances did change and suddenly a refurbishment scheme became a better planning solution, a better commercial solution, bearing in mind Marks and Spencer's stated position is that they will always consider refurbishment as a first step, I would have expected them to have embraced that. So, I mean, we're in the worlds of conjecture and fiction, I'm afraid.
And then on page 26, we have the continuation of box 4, which is the planning application submission stage information requirements, which starts at the end of page 25.
Yeah.
And the 5th point in that box 4 is confirmation that options for retaining existing buildings and structures have been fully explored before considering substantial demolition. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I now just want to ask you some questions about the interaction between policy and guidance, because I know it's something that's troubled you about SAVE's approach. So, and I think the best thing to do is to ask this question by reference to something which Mel Allwood says in her rebuttal, CD 10.15. Got a copy of that?
Not to hand.
Sorry, it's not 10.5, it's 10.15.
Okay.
10.5
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah. Sorry, what's the reference?
Paragraph 14, please. Here, Ms. Allwood is talking about the guidance, which I think she's collectively looking at both the circular economy guidance and also the whole life carbon assessment guidance, indeed also the BC guidance. But just looking at what she says in the first sentence of paragraph 14, the purpose of the guidance is to assist the GLA as the custodian of the London Plan to form its expert judgment as to whether the provisions of the plan have been complied with. And do you assume you agree with what Ms. Allwood says there?
Well, I think in the generality guidance, obviously, that's the purpose it's intended to perform, but the policy here requires a whole life carbon assessment. That's the policy requirement, and that's been done. Sure. What this tells you is how the GLA suggests that you embark on that process. But it's also clear that guidance, whilst logically we would all use the London Plan guidance, there is other guidance on whole life carbon assessment. There's not one size fits all. I mean, the policy requirement is for an assessment of whole life carbon, and the assumption is that that will be done in accordance with the London Plan guidance.
You agree with what she says in that first sentence, though?
Well, it's to us, yes, as a generality, the guidance, yes, as a generality, but in this case and in relation to policy SI2, the policy is met by the submission of the whole life carbon assessment. It can't be said that the policy is not met if the GLA template has been submitted.
And although the guidance itself is not policy, we're all agreed on that, it is an aid to the application of a policy, isn't it?
Yes, it's guidance to how you do a whole life carbon assessment, but as I say, and considered in the round, it quite fairly also identifies circumstances where demolition and redevelopment is the right solution for a site.
It informs the decision maker how to assess an application under policy SI2 and decide whether the policy is being complied with.
Yes, in the sense of if the GLA concluded that the whole life carbon assessment was inadequate, the GLA could conclude that that technical requirement of the policy was not met. It would then have to reach a judgment as a whole on what the consequences of that would be.
And that's the GLA's conclusion. Is the GLA's conclusion binding on the inspector?
Binding on the inspector, but I think it's a highly material consideration in this case. Bear in mind the GLA is the custodian of the policy and also the author of the practice guidance.
But it would be open to the inspector to reach a different view to that of the GLA.
It would, certainly with this inspector, I'd never suggest what this inspector is open to him or not to do, but I think that it would be a very surprising conclusion that the GLA doesn't understand its own guidance.
Not quite the question I asked Mr. Goddard, but we move on. Although a breach of guidance is not a breach of policy, a breach of guidance is relevant in determining whether a policy is complied with. You agree with that? As a principle.
I think it depends on what you're describing as a breach. If, for example, it's a procedural breach, but it has no bearing on the outcome, then I really struggle to think that it could be implied that the policy is not complied with.
Substantive breach.
Well, a substantive breach of the substance of the conclusion, as opposed to the process or the procedure. I mean, guidance is guidance, and the only relevance to it is to inform policy decision based on the substantive matters.
Yeah.
So, matters as to whether, when and whether documents were submitted or not submitted, or in what form they were submitted, is not material to compliance with the policy.
Substantive breach.
Well, it's a
Substantive breach.
substantive breach in the sense that the conclusion was that it was the conclusion was the guidance fundamentally had not been complied with. Then SI2 Part F would not have been met, that the compliance that an appropriate whole life carbon assessment had not been submitted. We would then still have to reach an overall judgment about what the significance of that would be, if any, bearing in mind that the overall conclusion from the GLA was that the precondition, in other words, the strategic case for demolition, was already met.
Okay, so just to perhaps give a real world example of that general principle. and I know this is absolutely not your case, as you've made abundantly clear, but if a scheme in general terms was found, or an applicant for planning permission for a new build scheme was found to have failed for the purposes of the guidance to prioritise and fully explore retention and failed to demonstrate the benefits of demolition clearly outweigh the benefits of retention, that would be a breach of the guidance, wouldn't it?
It would not be complying with that principle of the guidance.
Yeah.
But if,
That's a substantive breach.
yes, but it's to say, if there was no consideration given to that, if it's obvious that the consideration was given to that, as in this case, then clearly it's not a breach of either the guidance and certainly not the policy, because there is no policy provision requiring consideration of refurbishment, and indeed the policies wholeheartedly support new development and additional floor space.
The policy SI2F requires the applicant to demonstrate actions taken to reduce life cycle carbon emissions. Yeah.
Yes.
So again, I know what your position is in relation to this case, but just thinking about it in general terms and just to understand how the policy and the guidance work together. If an applicant was found to have failed to prioritise and fully explore retention, failed to demonstrate that the benefits of demolition clearly outweigh the benefits of retention, then that decision maker would conclude a breach of the guidance and conclude a breach of policy SI2F due to a failure to demonstrate actions taken to reduce life cycle carbon.
If none of that happened, then I think that the guidance would not be complied with. The extent to which that is a breach of the policy, you'd have to look at the substance of what consequences flow from that. But, and I would also caveat, I'm very happy to obviously carry on this line of cross-examination, but I'm not the expert on the steps taken to reduce carbon in this case. Obviously, I don't want to trespass onto evidence that I'm not professing to be an expert on, but I'm happy with answering your questions the best I'm able.
And the answer in terms of how the policy and the guidance work, which is I think your expert.
Well, the guidance also is an ongoing process, as I've explained. It's an iterative process. So, these are ongoing targets. So, when you say failure to comply with measures to reduce carbon, I mean, certainly there's an expectation of measures to reduce carbon, which I'm aware that Solwood has set out what they are and what was done. But what I'm saying is that's an ongoing process. So there are still additional measures that can be taken. There's an ongoing process through consent and delivery and post completion. So this is an ongoing process, and it's met, but it will continue to be met.
And the substantive breaches of the guidance that I referred to would inform the inspector to conclude a breach of SI2F. And if you had substantive breaches of the kind that I described, and I know that's not what you're saying is the case here.
I'm struggling if there is a compelling case for demolition, which is something that's anticipated in 3.1.3. If you didn't provide any of the guidance, you wouldn't have provided the guidance. That's a truism. I mean, if that's
not the question I'm asking, Mr. Fuller. I'm asking about the interplay between the guidance and policy.
Well, I think if you didn't comply with the guidance, you didn't submit an assessment that was what's the word of the policy SI2F, an appropriate whole life assessment, then you would have failed to comply with that aspect of the policy. Whether that's a substantive breach in the sense that actually having done so would have made a difference, that's a judgment for the planning authority using its judgment overall.
Right.
To say, actually, if there's not a document, then clearly we're
I mean, that's a procedure.
This is all done. But if it was not done, there would be a breach of that requirement.
Well, that's a procedural breach.
Yes,
that's the point I'm making. You haven't made the application, you simply haven't submitted the information. But I'm asking you, as I've said, about substantive breaches. If you find that there's been a failure to prioritise and fully explore retention.
Well, I don't see that because it's an ongoing process, and when you fully explore reducing carbon, that's an ongoing process. The policy requirement is a procedural one in SI2F to submit an appropriate whole life carbon assessment, which is then an ongoing process. Procedural or methodological criticisms of the whole life assessment, in my view, don't don't go to the substance of whether you've complied with the policy or not.
Mr. Goddard, I'm very sorry, it's my fault, but I'm not asking you about procedural concerns. I'm asking you about substantive
It's that the
breaches of the guidance.
SI2F is a procedural requirement to submit a whole life carbon that's acceptable.
And if the guidance requires an applicant to demonstrate that they have prioritised and fully explored retention, and that they then demonstrate that the benefit of demolition clearly outweighs the benefits of retention. If they fail to do that, then that's a breach of the guidance. We agree on that.
Well, it might be a breach of the guidance, but it's not a breach of the policy. Guidance can't introduce policy. So if the
Right, no.
guidance, sorry, if I can just continue, if the guidance suggests that you should prioritise refurbishment, the policy doesn't. There's no policy requirement to do so.
Well, the policy
So
requirement,
if you were in breach of that, in terms of the guidance, that's not in breach of the policy because the policy doesn't require that. So no, I disagree.
well, it's not quite, Mr. Goddard, you're not quite understanding the question I'm asking. The policy, as we've agreed, requires the applicant to demonstrate actions taken to reduce life cycle carbon
Yes.
emissions. That's what policy SI2F says. And we know, we've agreed as well, that the guidance informs the application of the policy.
It doesn't introduce new policy tests.
It does not introduce the new policy test, but it's an aid to the decision maker in applying what the policy has been breached. And I'm putting to you that if the decision maker concludes that there are substantive breaches of the guidance because of, for example, a failure to prioritise and robustly or fully explore retention, then they are matters which should lead the decision maker to conclude a breach of policy SI2F. Not because they're breaches of guidance, but because they inform the policy breach, don't they?
No, we may not be able to reach agreement on this. For the reasons I've given, that you're taking one aspect of the guidance, the non-statutory guidance, which is not a policy requirement, suggesting that a breach of that aspect of the guidance would be a breach of the policy. I don't agree.
It would be a relevant consideration in determining whether the policy has been breached. Could we at least agree that?
Well, it would be a relevant consideration in determining whether an appropriate whole life carbon assessment has been submitted. But it doesn't go to a breach of the policy because the policy doesn't require that.
So a breach of the guidance, a substantive breach of the guidance would not be relevant to the question
Well, because
of whether the policy is being applied.
it would be a procedural point. It's not a policy point because there is no policy requirement for them to consider refurbishment.
So, okay, so your evidence to the inquiry is that an applicant could commit substantive breaches of the policy of the guidance, and that would be irrelevant to the decision maker's approach to whether the policy is being complied with.
No, I'm not saying it would be irrelevant. It would go to whether an appropriate whole life assessment had been submitted, which is the requirement of the policy.
Yeah.
If you take a specific point from the whole of the guidance and say that specific point has not been addressed. I mean, clearly we're in a completely separate situation to the reality of this case, where it seems to be common ground, it has been assessed. But leaving that aside, I don't think you would conclude that the substantive breach of the guidance if one aspect of that guidance, which is not a policy requirement, had not been addressed in the way the guidance expected it to be addressed.
So you keep referring to the idea of an appropriate whole life carbon assessment.
Well, that's what the policy
What the policy
requires.
requires. So if the breaches of the guidance have resulted in the decision maker concluding that an inappropriate whole life carbon assessment had been submitted, that would then lead to a policy breach.
Yeah, you wouldn't have complied with SI2F if you hadn't submitted an appropriate whole life carbon assessment. I'm happy to get that. Seems to me a clear point.
Fine.
The point I think I was making was in relation to you seeking to interpose the requirement to consider refurbishment into the policy.
No, and that's certainly not my intention because it's very clearly in the guidance.
Mr. Fraser, is that a good point for a break? How are you
Um,
doing? Are you nearly finished?
We started at 2:15, didn't we? So
We
I'm
did.
just thinking, yeah, I mean, that is the end of the questions on SI2. I do have some other policy questions, but
I mean, if there are only 15 minutes, we'll carry on. If they're more than that, we'll take a break.
they're going to be more than that. So.
Okay. So if we take a break and from from now until 4:15. Inquiry is adjourned.